Okay, so welcome all of you. Let me first introduce myself. I'm Frank de Koning. I'm one of the two directors of BRIAS, the Brussels Institute for Advanced Studies. My colleague Serge Jomain is abroad right now. Let me also start wishing you all a very healthy, fruitful, and creative new year. And I say creative because this is, of course, the ultimate goal also of BRIAS. The Institute of Advanced Studies is a concept which was developed nearly 100 years ago in Princeton in 1930. And the idea was, and still is, that if you bring together high-level scientists from different fields, and you offer them an environment in which they can work quietly without daily hassles on their subject, interact, discuss, disagree, etc., creative ideas will emerge. And we have seen this in Princeton with Einstein and others, of course, and Oppenheimer, etc. And this is the goal of the different Institute for Advanced Studies which have been created all over the world. Not very many, though, and we were the very first one here in Belgium. The idea by the then rectors of VUB, Caroline Pauwels, and Yvon Angler from ULB was to create this institute together in order not only to foster collaboration between the universities, but also with centers worldwide. The idea here is to invite what we call senior fellows and junior fellows from the neighboring universities to work together on a specific theme. The theme which was the pilot theme for BRIAS about now 4 years ago, was on food. Food, past, present, and future in sustainable development. The second theme was on robotics and artificial intelligence. And the third theme right now is, of course, on democracy. And it's a pleasure to see that you are here. This is not the official opening ceremony, which will be held on January 22. If you didn't register urgently because only a few spots left, because we have a limit in this room of 100 persons. And with this, it's my pleasure to give the floor to Jasper.
Hi, everyone. I would also like to warmly welcome you to the kickoff of the first BRIAS seminar of this year. I'm honored to introduce my former colleague, we shared an office, Dr. Ruben van Severen, who recently defended his PhD in Ghent, and he is one of the few true political psychologists in the world, I may say, and you can see it already with his double affiliation. He's now currently doing 2 postdocs at the same time, one in the lab of social psychology, where I did my PhD, and also in the Department of Public Governance. And I was also part of his guidance committee, and I saw his trajectory. I saw the creative ideas coming up along the way. We both share an interest in political cynicism, polarization, populism. These are all things that will come back here in his presentation. So without further ado, I welcome Ruben to the floor.
All right, thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for coming here. I see many faces, which I'm happy about. As Jasper said, I am affiliated with the Department of Social Psychology. I'm a psychologist myself. But the research project that I started in 4 years ago when I started my PhD was very much an interdisciplinary endeavor. It was together with the Department of Public Governance, also from Ghent, and also with political scientists. The book you see, it's my PhD, and the research that I conducted within my PhD is also what I'll be talking about today. It has a more fancy title in the book, but basically I studied how citizens view alternatives to democracy. Now I want to start, and I think this is just interesting also for this kickoff session, to just give you an overview of some of the problems, some of the issues that democracy, and more specifically representative democracy, is facing nowadays. In literature, you could say there are a lot of symptoms of this crisis. Symptoms relating to voting behavior or voter turnout, to political trust from citizens in their governments and their politicians. There are also issues with regards to the types of leaders that we are electing nowadays, and there is also increasingly conflict, not between citizens and politics, but also between political conflict between citizens. These are global trends that I wanted to share. Looking here across all electoral democracies, it included 116 countries. When you look at voter turnout from the 1940s up until this data was up until 2010, you see that there is a decline in turnout. Whereas in the 1940s it would be up to 80%, it is now lower, usually something around 60% if you look at a global average. Political scientists would talk about a golden age of participation that is kind of behind us, and more citizens appear to be abandoning politics. Still not the majority, it seems like, but there's a trend. This trend might be explained also because there's a lot of friction, or there's a gap between citizens and the governments that are supposed to work in service of them. If you look at trust, this 75% that is on the slide, it's specifically data from the US, asking people in the 1960s whether or not they believe their government, or they trust their government to do the right thing most of the time. It would be 75% in the 1960s. Today, that's only 20%. Politicians are also among the least trusted professions. To just give you an idea of how big the problem is, you could say, they score lower than advertisers and bankers, and they also tie with social media influencers. It's not only a lack of trust, it's increasingly a cynical view of politics as well, whereby there is a lack of faith in the good intentions or the motives of politicians, and also a lack of faith in the idea that we can make the best decisions through our democratic governance. So this all indicates a growing gap as well between citizens and government. This growing gap is also something that leaders nowadays like to capitalize on. Leaders such as Trump, but there are others who really like to capitalize on this divide and say that there's a divide between the people and the elite, and that the traditional parties, let's say, don't really want to tackle the real issues. Those on the right typically say that most issues, they reduce it to a simplistic idea that a lot of the problems are because of cultural threats, they would say, related to immigration, for example, whereas those on the extreme left, I would say, also present a more simplistic view of the world as being compromised because there's a hierarchy and there is not a fair distribution. Whether or not you agree what the real issues are is not very relevant to my presentation, but the rise of these leaders illustrates that there is, or it illustrates the depth of the divide. And then finally, we also see increasing polarization. So it's not, what it comes down to is that it's not just ideological, it's also emotional. People are not just taking on more extreme stances on certain issues. They also increasingly dislike those who have other opinions. So that makes it harder to find common ground. So there's a lot of symptoms that point to this crisis, but maybe there is some hope. I want to nuance this a little bit before I go further. This is also looking at global data from the World Values Survey, from Pew Research as well. If you ask people, just a very principled or like broad question, whether democracy is the best system to govern, then 89% globally seems to agree on this statement. The dissatisfaction or the problem is more with its practice. 60% of people are unhappy with how democracy functions. 74% of people say that politicians don't care about people like them, and 42% also feels that no party represents their views. So people love democracy, but despair at how it is practiced. So it appears that our representative democracy, the system that is most used, the prototypical system, is at somewhat of a crossroads, and it needs to decide where to go. Now there are various, in the literature, there are various ideas regarding how we can supplement our representative democracy, or sometimes even replace certain aspects of it. The first vision would be related to, or people would say that many of our problems are because we have too much citizen involvement and they would like to limit it. Another vision would say, oh, we could, there's a lot of, or they agree that there's a lot of benefit, we could reap benefits from expanding citizen involvement. With regard to the first vision, you don't simply limit citizen involvement, there is an alternative. And some would say that policy making is just better left to experts or to those with technical knowledge on certain issues. In the literature, it has also been referred to as stealth democracy. It's a sort of politics that is operating in the background. And the idea is that citizens are not necessarily all too interested in following politics, and many of them also find it okay that they have a group of experts deciding the course of action. The idea also is that it could lead to more efficient and to more stable governing. Stable because there's less of a risk of having these populist shifts, and elections can also be very volatile. Examples in Flanders, for example, are Mark van Ranst. It's an example of a more minimal form of experts. It's an expert that gave advice to governing bodies. But there are also more maximal forms. For example, this is a picture from the Monti government in 2011 in Italy. It was a technocratic cabinet that was in charge of decision making for a period of time. They were non-elected also. They were like appointed. Then the second vision would say, no, we do need citizens. We need more citizens, and we need to find ways to include their opinions or get a better insight into what their opinions are, next to only which leaders they want. They focus on inclusion and empowering citizens, and there are also various tools in which you can do so. The literature is a lot more specific than the way I present it here, but basically I like the distinction between tools that focus on talking, you call it deliberative democracy, small groups of citizens that are informed and that get to discuss issues, or there's also voting tools which are more majoritarian. It's direct democracy, and it refers to referendums or various sorts of referendums. You have as an example of such a talking tool in Belgium, I think it was in 2011, the G1000 started. This was a very successful initiative, and it also inspired various spin-offs, whereas in the Germanic part of Belgium, Oost-Belgium, you have, and I think also in Brussels now, you have really more institutionalized forms of deliberative democracy. And this is regarding the voting tools. This is just a graph showing you the amount of countries that allow referendums and various types of referendums by law. So you see from the up until 2010, you see that there's just a lot more countries also allowing it. And there's a third option, if you can really call it an option. It goes beyond democracy. And it usually just includes people's preferences for an absolute leader or a party. And I mention it here because in my PhD it's also touched upon in chapter 2. But the main vision, or the main thing that I focused on in my research, is those two alternative visions. So there were 4 empirical chapters in my PhD. They are cumulative. I try to make each one build on the other one and tackle a different issue. Chapter 2, I tried to set the stage by looking a bit more at the bigger picture, by looking how stable citizen support is for democracy in times of crisis, and are citizens open to replacements in those times of crisis. The second one looks at democratic design. If you look at those, the second vision, if citizens are to be involved, what limits and formats of citizen involvement are preferred? In chapter 4, I focus on polarization, more specifically polarized issues. Do people's preferences for ways of deciding change for polarized issues? And then in the final chapter, I try to take a more boots on the ground approach by really looking at a local case and seeing whether people's attitudes that we observed in the earlier chapters or how they translate to practice. With regards to chapter 2, how stable is citizen support for democracy, and do they become open to replacements? Well, I conducted 3 survey experiments in Belgium and the UK. Basically, there's more details, but basically I presented people with a number of societal threat scenarios. It was a vignette study. These were there was a lot of variety, but it could be a vignette on terrorism, on war, regarding climate or natural disasters, or regarding the economy. There was also a vignette on hyperinflation. And then we measured, after presenting people with those scenarios, we measured people's support for various government systems. There were 3 studies. There were variations, but this is just one of the findings, one of the figures that was replicated across all 3 studies, and that I wanted to just briefly walk you through. Just the gray line is the baseline. So that was a scenario or a vignette in which there was no presentation of a threat. And we compare it to the colored lines, which were the various threat scenarios. And then on the horizontal axis, you have the types of regimes, basically. So what I want to show here is that during these threat scenarios, we see that people showed higher support for experts compared to the baseline. If you look at autocracy, so the third option that I presented, you see that most of the threat scenarios increase people's preferences for an absolute leader. It made an absolute leader more appealing, but as you can see, it's also in line with what you would expect. The autocratic support does not really rise above the others. And then with regards to deliberative and direct democracy, basically deliberative is the talking and direct democracy is the voting tool that I presented earlier. You see that during threats, people show lower support for citizen involvement. And then our representative democracy, you see that during threats, support also lowers, but it is still a valued a valued system also in times of threat, and citizens are not really looking to, and it's also in line with the literature, are not really looking to see it replaced. So then the question is, if they are not willing to replace it, how could they be willing to supplement it? That's what I looked at in chapter 3, where we asked, is there a limit to how much input citizens should give? Or how much power? Should they only advise? Should they be allowed to co-decide, or should they decide? We were also interested here in which types of participatory tools that people are most supportive of. And then finally, we also looked at variation across groups within the citizenry, looking at ideology, which in the survey was self-placement on a left or right scale, and also looking at cynicism, what I was talking about earlier. To answer these questions, I conducted a large-scale survey in Flanders as part of the larger group project that I was in. And we had a demographically representative sample. Going over to the results. When it comes to the level of power, you see that co-decision, so government and citizens deciding together, which is somewhat vague, but it was a deliberate choice here, is scored higher. And you see that consultation or mere consultation or giving citizens full control over policy decisions, so the decisive scenario, is seen as suboptimal, but they are all seen as good additions to the traditional representative democracy. Then secondly, looking at which types of tools they want to use. We focused on, it was in the Flemish context, so we focused on those tools that are most used and that are most known to citizens, and we compared them to local elections. Basically, the finding here is that voting tools, those tools that attract or that aim to look at a broader set of opinions, are more supported by citizens than talking tools. I should note that this is also, well, people are generally supportive of all of the tools that give them more input, and these are slight nuances. But I mean, the effect is there. Voting tools are seen as better than talking tools. Also, if you look at the variation between groups, you see that the people on the ideological left slightly prefer those talk-centric tools, which are here the citizen panel and the advisory council. And people on the right are somewhat more in favor of vote-centric tools, which is the citizen consultation. And what was most apparent from our findings is that those who are very cynical are also most supportive of binding referendums, so referendums in which they get the final say, in which the outcome is implemented. So citizens appear to want more voice, and but design also matters. Then, in this previous chapter, we purposely did not look too much. We did not want our findings to be biased by which policy issues we were looking at exactly. Now, in chapter 4, I did think there's a difference between policy issues. Some issues are more salient, some issues are more ideological, some are more ideologically polarized than others, and there's good reason to believe that there is a difference in how people want decisions to be made depending on certain characteristics of the topic. Now, to study this, I ran a survey in the US with 1,200 participants. Respondents evaluated a number of models that are apparent or are used in the US context. And we compared, for each political issue that we presented them with, we gave them the models and then asked them to rate those models. We also looked at whether there are differences differences between the three main political groups in the US, in light of polarization as well, between the Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. And we also wanted to see whether or how we can explain any differences between groups. So what we found very clearly is that polarized issues can shift people's preferences. Here you see on the horizontal axis, those are the various decision-making models. So in the US, we also included the Supreme Court. That was basically based on the idea that we looked at abortion, and the Supreme Court also has somewhat more say in those topics than typically here in Europe, let's say. Looking at politicians, so that's the representative model, also at experts, and then citizen panel, referendum, and a hybrid form. The hybrid form is basically a combination of citizen panel and a referendum. There's a lot of research being done in the Netherlands, I know, on combining those different forms, voting and talking, and whether or not there are benefits to it. And I wanted to include that also here, to see what citizens think about it. So what you see, referendums are, and those are binding referendums, are most preferred for ideologically polarized issues. That was for abortion and for gun control. Those were the issues that I focused on. These issues were also pre-tested to see whether they don't differ too much on these on other characteristics that we're not interested in. Experts were most preferred for the non-polarized issues. And I should note, that's important here, you can see referendum, whether or not it's for polarized or non-polarized issues. Here, you would say there's no real difference. But the difference is, of course, in relation to the other models, which are less preferred or more preferred. So you basically see for the polarized issues, referendum is highest compared to the other models, and for non-polarized issues, the experts. We also try to look at how we can explain people's preferences, and here we found that citizens are very pragmatic. That's also in line with the literature. It basically means when citizens think that a certain model is going to lead to an outcome that is favorable for them, desirable, the outcome that they want, that shows a huge correlation with their support for the model. Now, you could say that makes it difficult, but still you see that certain models are better than others, even if you ask citizens, and we also did that in the survey, if you tell citizens, look, imagine you're not getting the outcome you want, still what do you think is the best model, then you still see this same pattern. And also, importantly, we find cross-party agreement on what the best fits are, meaning that Democrats, Independents, and Republicans all say that referendums are the best model for polarized issues, and with experts is the same thing. Now, I don't take a normative stance here saying that we should just organize referendums. But at least I think what citizens are conveying here is that they want to keep ideologically charged issues closer to the people, and they want to have more say on it than only getting to elect a leader once every year. So they want to be, they want their opinions to be shown and to be gouged more frequently. Then finally, going from principles to practice, I conducted a study in Kortrijk. Some of you may know it. It's a city in Flanders. Basically, we wanted to answer the question, or I should first give you some information on Kortrijk. Kortrijk was interesting for the research group that I was in. It was a case that we selected. And we selected it based on the fact that Kortrijk organized a series of referendums from 2020 up until now, and they are still doing it. And that is somewhat unique in the Belgian context, in that it's usually, it's not done that much. And also here, what was specifically interesting is that the governments were, or the referendums were morally binding, meaning that the government pledged to follow the outcome. That's interesting because in chapter 3 I found that those people who are very cynical about politics are strong fans of binding referendums. So I wanted to see whether when we look in practice and those referendums are organized, do they actually engage with it? Do they care about it? Do they support it? And do they also vote? This is just showing you the main result from the study. What we found, the 3 lines are the 3 referendums. Those are on the local level, and you see as people who score higher on political cynicism actually evaluate the referendums more negatively than those who score lower on political cynicism, which is a bit puzzling, which was a bit weird because in our chapter 3 we found, they are most fond of those tools. They were also less likely to participate here. So there's a gap. The main idea is that we found a gap between what you would think in principle and what the practice shows. Of course, we also looked at several explanations here. When it came to the case in Kortrijk, we found that it was related to the topics, specifically the salience of the topics. And we found that there was a mediator basically showing that political cynics were less fond of the referendums because they also thought the topics were not really about anything. The topics were also selected by the government top-down. And I think also there, but that's something to explore further. I think the fact that that topics are selected by the government which cynics do not trust, probably also explains why they don't care about it. So, but still, you see this gap here. The implication here is that when there is no substance to the topic, there is a risk to further alienate those people, those cynical people. Which, with direct democracy, the idea oftentimes is you can actually get them, you give them tools or you try to get them back into politics, but here you see the opposite. So there's some danger here that direct democracy, if it's not implemented well, it risks burning the very bridges it could build. I also want to go over some overarching lessons over the various that emerged from the various chapters. Maybe obvious, but there is no really universally applicable model. Legitimacy tends to depend on the context. So in crisis situations in chapter 2, we see that experts are seen as experts as a replacement for representative democracy is seen as more viable by citizens. In chapter 4, we also looked at when you supplement representative democracy, it depends on the issue, how exactly citizens want to see it supplemented. So when it's about less ideological or less polarized issues, citizens are more favorable towards expertise. When it's about ideological and polarized issues, they want more input. So democratic model should fit the specific problem at hand, and it also implies that many of these models or these visions that I was presenting in the beginning should complement each other and not replace each other, and that's also what a majority of citizens agree on. Then, lesson 2, citizens differ, but common ground is possible. There's no such thing as the citizen. We also looked at differences in people's social demographic backgrounds across many of these studies, ideological differences, but also differences in cynicism and distrust. And these differences determine people's preferences. But what we also found across most of the chapters is that those group differences between people are usually smaller than the model differences. And that's just a difficult way of saying there is more common ground than that there is divergence on how we should make our political decisions. In chapter 3, we found that most citizens are in favor of co-decisive scenarios, government-citizen cooperation. In chapter 4, citizens across the political spectrum favor more input for polarized issues and experts for non-polarized issues. So I think the implication here, and of course there needs to more studies should also try to back this up, but introducing those alternative or complementary processes do not necessarily have to create new divides between citizens regarding the processes, of course. And then finally, watch out for hurdles from theory to practice. You may also think that makes a lot of sense, but I want to just remind everyone of this again, is that preferences can really shift once they are tested in real contexts. When issues become real or apparent, citizens become more pragmatic and they start thinking, how does this benefit me? And we also see this because well, cynics appear to want referendums in theory, but not necessarily when there is no substance to them. So the implication here is, I personally think, that democracy is never really finished, not on a theoretical basis, but also not in the actual policy-making practice, and it can be treated as somewhat of an ongoing experiment, in which we should try to look more how citizens evaluate changes that are going on, and where I think there should also be more collaboration between scholars and policymakers. Then moving ahead, what are some future avenues? I think a first one that I want to stress is that we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. The baby being representative democracy. And there are, of course, also things that you can change to the way we organize our elections, and those might also change what citizens think about representative democracy. For example, in the US, a majority of citizens, this is also from Pew Research, when it comes to electing a president, majority of citizens want to support a popular vote instead of the electoral college deciding. But that's not the reality. There's also a lot of support for independent redistricting commissions, which basically are some way to mitigate gerrymandering or control over the outcomes. In Europe, you see various indications as well. There are debates on electoral thresholds, whether those should be increased or lowered, and also on district magnitudes. In the UK specifically, I found a study showing that 60% of citizens favor, it was just a broad question, but 60% of citizens favor electoral reforms compared to only 27% in 2011. In Flanders, for example, we only recently abolished the compulsory voting in local elections, and that also sparked quite a lot of debate. And I just want to say, alongside supplementing representative democracy, we should also look what those changes are doing to people's perception of representative democracy itself. Then something I focused less on in my presentation and in my research is the fact that those multiple visions, which includes different actors, they can, of course, also be brought together, and people can also have preferences to that reflect this idea. And there's research being done by it's Tessa Hazevoet from my lab, for example, but also Jean-Benoît Pilet from CVPol. I don't know if many of you will know him probably, but looking at those hybrid configurations and trying to figure out what citizens think of them. And interestingly here is that existing work also shows that including those actors at the same time, each actor can actually boost different aspects of legitimacy, whereby experts, obviously, due to their technical knowledge, are seen for producing better output. But if you involve citizens, people would say that process or decision-making is more legitimate because citizens are providing more input. And it's more inclusive and more representative. So that's also an aspect of legitimacy. Then also there are new actors to get into the mix, and artificial intelligence is one that we cannot really ignore. And I think I'm also looking in my own research how I can put it in there. So key questions here are like which configurations do citizens perceive as most legitimate, and thus support depend on role distributions, which of these actors should always get the end decision, which one should advise, etc. And then finally, this is something that I would like to focus on in my postdoc. I'm writing my proposal on this right now. But there's this unresolved tension in research on political negativity, is how I broadly call it, but what I mean by this is basically what citizens think about their governments. And I should first give you the tension. The tension is that many of those negative evaluations, people being angry about politics, can actually strengthen democracy in some way. It could lead to holding leaders accountable for their wrongdoings. It could lead to more support for referendums. It could lead to participation that could correct some of the flaws that are in representative democracy. But at the other hand, it can also pull citizens away from democracy. We know that people who are very cynical, they also show more of a rejection of representation of democracy, and they also show more attraction to strong leaders. Now, we don't really understand this tension. We know that it happens, but we don't really know when exactly and why this negativity and all this anger and cynicism leads to either of these outcomes. And some things that I think future research should really focus on is grappling more with the issues with existing concepts. So trust, distrust, cynicism, they all have their own literatures. But what you see there, and that's an interesting paper by Sanne Reekhoff, is someone working at Texas University, is that those concepts that are used to probe the gap between citizens and politics conflate different types of judgments and also often different targets. And with types of judgments, I mean, is it about incompetence? Do people think that politicians are, they just lack the ability or the skill? Or is it about something more relating to their character, their integrity, their morality, the fact that they are out of touch, the fact that they are self-serving? And different targets, sometimes it's about politicians, sometimes these measurements are about institutions, sometimes about the political system as a whole. And there's not, I feel like in the literature, there's not always, it's not always clear what exactly is being conceptualized and what is being measured. Now, in social psychological literature, there is actually, it would actually be used as a tool to conceptualize what are the important judgments that we should be focusing on. And for example, there's a whole literature on perceptions of others and how perceptions of others are categorized. And the two big factors that come out of this across in this literature is usually one on competence and one on morality and or integrity. It's sometimes also called warmth. And I think this could be relevant also to understand this negativity towards politics in this day and age better. Also, what's important here is that with cynicism, we are still using the same items that we were using, let's say 50 or 60 years ago, but in this day and age with everything being so polarized, there is some evidence that these items are not really ideal, because when you ask people to rate their agreement with the statement of all politicians are self-serving, they have, there's research showing this, that there is a bias in which when you ask people to rate all politicians, they are actually rating out-group politicians that they don't agree with. So we also need to try to combine or merge literatures that look at these various targets. Whether people's judgments are about candidates only, whether it's about certain parties that they don't identify with themselves, or whether it's really about all politicians. Because I think there, certain combinations, I think the main idea here is that judging someone's moral character or judging an entire group of people's moral character is going to lead to different conceptions of democracy. And then there's also, that's the second issue, there's no really a clear account of which affective or motivational reactions people have to what politicians do. But we know from the literature that there's a literature on moral transgressions, for example, and we know that moral transgressions are they elicit different emotions than, for example, a lapse of judgment or competence failures. So these discrete emotions produce different motivations. Basically, the literature on moral transgressions regarding politicians say that it leads to something like disgust and resentment, whereas competence leads to less strong and less effective reactions. And these, I think, could be solving both these gaps could help us to get a better idea of when cynicism and distrust and anger is actually a threat to democracy, or whether it can strengthen it. Okay, that was it for me. Thanks for listening. If you are interested in some of the full publications that I have, of the studies that I've been talking about, you can you have the references here. If you want to follow updates, I try to post on LinkedIn if I have done something that I think is interesting. We also have this link is participatieve democratie.be. It's from the research group that I started in 4 years ago. We also do a lot of comparative work where we not only look at citizens' preferences for political decision making, but also at politicians' preferences, also civil servants, and also even looking at civil society organizations and then comparing those preferences. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check the website. Okay, thank you, and feel free to ask any questions.
Questions, comments, suggestions?
This way. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I'm very intrigued by your chapter 2, where you actually see how people react to crisis. I have a sociological background, and I always have the question whether different social groups would respond differently to these crises. For example, more dominant groups versus more dominated groups. Have you looked to, and I repeat it a little bit, have you looked to whether the responses to these crises vary by social group, for example?
That's an interesting question in this chapter 2, because we manipulated in study 2 and 3. We also manipulated various other aspects of those threats. We also manipulated whether it was an external threat, so coming from another country, or internal. So there was a lot of variation there already, which made it so that I did not really include those. It's a bit of a disappointing answer. I did not include those individual differences, but I do think there are individual differences between people that would also shape how they react to those threats. There is some research being done also in my department on types of threats. So whether or not they're more typically left-wing threats or right-wing threats. A left-wing threat would then be typically relating to climate change, for example, whereas a right-wing threat would be immigration. And we are taking a look at or trying to see whether certain groups are indeed more scared by certain threats than others. But I cannot give you the exact answer right now. It's okay. Interesting question, though.
Right. Thank you very much. I think this was a wonderful kickoff of the BRIA seminars.
Thank you.
I also have some questions on the second chapter, especially the results from the vignette. I think it was slide 8 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And you show that support for deliberative democracy is lowest in all across all threat scenarios, I think.
Yes.
I was just wondering there. No, we passed it. There we are.
Yes.
I was just wondering there whether it's not just an artifact of actually knowing what deliberative democracy is, because I mean, people are well aware with direct democracy, with voting referendums, representative democracy, potentially technocracy, but deliberative democracy is fairly new. So I wonder, do you have like any measurements of knowledge of deliberative democracy, whether they know what it is, or whether they have heard about it or participated in any types of events? So I think that was probably my first question. And then the second one is, I was not really surprised by the high level of support for technocracy, because most of the things that, most of the threats that are occurring or that you expose them to are kind of like immediate events like terrorism or natural disasters. So in that case, you don't have much time to make decisions, right? You want technocrats or people that are competent to make immediate decisions to fight natural disasters or terrorism or hyperinflation. I think deliberative democracy or citizen engaged types of democracy, such as direct and deliberative types, they work best probably when you have a bit of time to reflect and to gather people, and it takes much more organization than the more immediate types, such as technocracy. So it might also be a temporal type of issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's those are good reflections, I think. With regards to the first one, I did not control for it here with whether people know about deliberative democracy to a lesser extent than direct democracy. What I do want to say is that across the entire literature, you see that citizens are more attracted to direct democracy, and it's not only because they don't know it. It's also because there is this idea that for citizens at least, it's very important that decisions are broadly supported. And that is something in deliberative democratic settings that it's just not always there, because it's just not possible to really involve a huge group of people to discuss. So it's I didn't control for it here, but across the literature, it's a very like robust finding, also across countries, I would say. So that kind of shows you, I think, that there's other reasons. And with regards to the second question, whether the technocracy or the support for technocracy is only temporal, I think that makes sense. And also in the survey, we didn't really specify exactly how long this period of time was. It was just, the question was basically, you have this scenario, which was like kind of detailed, and then we asked, to what extent do you find these government systems appropriate? And that was basically the question. But I think if you would ask citizens, indeed, they would probably find it appropriate until the crisis is completely over, and then it might switch again.
Maybe just one follow-up. In the other chapters, you distinguish between advisory and binding types of innovations. You didn't do so here, but I imagine that there might be some difference in binding referendums and advisory referendums in these types of threat situations, right?
Yes, could be. Indeed, here it was more binding. It was also, as it was the first chapter of my PhD, I really wanted to look at the big picture, as I said, and really look at those pure ideal forms of regimes. It was also like what we asked is, during these times of crisis, do you think it would be like the representative democracy, but with deliberative and direct democracy? We also just asked, we operationalized it as direct democracy, a system in which citizens need to vote on all issues. And with deliberative democracy, it's, yeah. So I am completely open to the idea that that there are like specific aspects that you can manipulate that would create changes to the findings.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. It was really super interesting talk.
Thank you.
I have two set of questions, actually. So you opened your talk by showing how much the turnout went down, right?
Mhm.
And I was thinking at that point, and then you talked very eloquently about the fact that people are not that happy with representative democracy. And I was thinking of all these people that don't show up. Probably part of them don't do it because they don't believe in the system or some kind of protest, but some part of them are genuinely not interested in politics. They really don't care. And I was wondering, related to this picture, if you know what is the motoretic effect here of political interest. If when we control for political interest, we would find the same peaks in terms of preferences. So that would be my first question. And then I have one that leverage the critique of political theorists to deliberative democracy. So not all of them are so happy with it because they say it risks to be even more exclusionary, right? These people that are not really engaged with politics, they are going to find this threshold to participate even higher. So it could create actually a perverse effect there, and it's also exclusionary de facto, because if you are not if you don't have the time, if you don't have the instruments, if you're really not well educated, deliberative democracy might just be another threshold, while voting it's inherently democratic in a sense, right? It's relatively simple, it requires somewhat the same sophistication from all citizens. So I think it links also to the importance of political interest and maybe even political knowledge in trying to understand how this affects preferences and also instruments.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you have any interesting findings in your work about this.
Findings, less so, but we did look at, in chapter 3, when we looked at people's preferences to supplement representative democracy, we did look at socio-demographic influences. And there you see that the people who are more in minority positions or in more marginalized groups, or those who are, let's say, they're less represented in politics, would be younger people. But also when we look at the effect of gender, for example, you see that those who are less represented in politics do prefer those direct or deliberative tools that give them more voice. That indeed, like this finding is a finding of its own, and it does not necessarily mean that those people, especially with the deliberative democracy, that they will also engage with it when they are invited. I don't immediately have findings on it, but indeed there is a problem with deliberative democracy or with citizen panels that it's a critique that is like pretty well known, that it attracts the usual suspects and not the people who would actually benefit, or not the people who are actually unheard. If that makes sense. So that is something to consider indeed when looking at deliberative democracy, and when organizing citizen panels, that you get those people involved, and that you also, when people are together, that you create the conditions so that everyone can speak in equal terms. Because what also happens is indeed those who are very much politically interested, knowledgeable, they are the ones who will take the stage, basically. They're going to be more confident, and they will be able to push through, I guess, their opinion a little bit more than others. So I understand your question, and yeah, but I don't have any specific findings, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting and timely, I would say. I have a kind of big and slightly provoking questions on your conclusions. That is one of your most interesting finding is that citizens seems to prefer to have a say through referendums when the issue is polarizing, whereas they are okay with giving voice to experts when it is less polarizing one. And if I'm not wrong, you were also kind of suggesting that based on these, possible solution may be to integrate representative democracy by, adopting these two different options eventually, based on the issues at discussion. So regarding this, I wanted to ask you, do you genuinely think that this may be possible, since the classical view is to see representative democracy and technocracy as inherently alternative? And second point is, are there really issues that can be considered as being non-polarizing today? And I'm thinking, for example, of one of the cases of technocracy in government that you were mentioning, the Monti government in Italy. They had to take a decision on pensions, for instance, like they did this big reform of pensions that we may say is less polarizing than, I don't know, immigration or abortion or other stuff. But in the end, it was super polarizing in the country. And today, 10 years later, we are still discussing about that reform. So maybe in the end, having someone that is politically accountable, if we explain this to citizens, can still be preferred than having technocrats that are not really.
If we explain it to citizens, yeah, that's true. But regarding the first question, if I understand correctly, you ask whether or not I believe it's viable to combine or to actually supplement representative democracy with experts or more citizens at certain times. Yeah. I think that should be possible. I think it's. I'm not saying that these findings here, showing what citizens think and what citizens want, are like a blueprint for how to organize the decision making, of course. But it does signal what they want, and it's something that policymakers should take into account when they are dealing with how to solve certain policy issues. That's what I would say the findings are most interesting for. And then the second question, if you could just repeat.
If we can really distinguish in the end between polarizing and non-polar. Okay, we can do it based on data, of course, but are there some issues that can be considered non-polarizing to the extent that experts can be in charge of deciding on them? Like, well, I don't know, we can debate a lot.
Yeah,
on
I
this.
think we can indeed debate. It's.
I was just curious of your point on this, since you've been dedicating years on the topic.
No, I think there are differences though. Like, if you, for example, look at like abortion in the US is way more contentious than it is here, for example, and I think you can take that as a point, and you can compare those. You can compare those two. Yes, I think there are differences between certain issues, and that we should take it into account. But indeed. Issues can, even issues that don't appear very much polarizing, can become political very fast. So that's definitely true. And in the literature, in the pre-test that I did, I really tried to look at how do citizens conceive of certain topics, and what are the effects there, and trying to do it in an experimentally clean way. But I understand your points, and I'll reflect on it more in my research.
Thank you. Something I missed or maybe didn't understand well is the effect of scale. You mentioned local initiatives such as Kortrijk. And when I look at the place where I live, where we know the politicians, where we don't trust them, which is a common thing you've shown, we tend indeed to intervene and to try to force, I would say, decisions by the public, by the people living there. Okay? When we go to another scale, which is the country scale, The general agreement is that representative democracy is probably the best solution. Maybe, I don't know.
No, I understand your question.
It's a question. But then when we go even further, look at the situation today with with Trump saying that they will annex he wants to annex Greenland, etc. And we all say Europe has to be much stronger. Europe has to be strong, which is the autocratic, I would say, viewpoint. Because we don't have anything to say from the democratic point of view to decisions in Europe.
Yeah, I think the scale issue is an important one. It's one that was not really the main focus of my research, but indeed the local level is often seen as the cradle or the laboratory of democracy, they would say, or especially of participatory democracy, because it's closest to the people. The issues that people are dealing with at the local level are more likely to be issues that affect them directly, or affect their community directly. And also the relationship between citizens and government is different on the local level than on higher levels, because in smaller towns, citizens can actually sometimes encounter their politicians and see them. So I do understand the scale question. If I'm correct in your question, you're asking whether the question whether it's just not viable to really change our system too much when we look at the national or European level, or it's a question.
The graph you've shown.
This one?
Yes. If you do this on a local level, on a country level, or on a European level, would the graph be the same? I don't think so.
No, probably not. No, here the focus was very much, and we tried to keep this focus the same across all the scenarios to get a clean experimental test, of course. But here it was more these were like relatively major threats that would impact the national level. So yeah, it would be interesting to see whether at the local level, for example, I don't know, like you can check in big cities, for example, compare cities with a lot of higher crime rate to other cities, and then use this as a threat that is more apparent on the local level, and then see what people's government preferences are, and whether they also become somewhat more technocratic or autocratic. I think that would be the case when we're talking about things like crime or whatever, but it's something to further explore, I think. But thank you for the question. Actually, I do have one thing I want to say when it comes to scale. Well, you see in one of the big things that determines which regime a country ends up using historically is related to scale. For example, in China, you cannot even imagine how different it is from what we are doing here. The cities there have a population that is equal to the population of Belgium, and it's the scale demands different political decision making, and I think that is evident in when you start comparing scales of countries, indeed, and which regimes they tend to adopt. So.
Hi. First, congratulations for your PhD. It looks really like a very, very good PhD with like empirical chapters, having every time a research question that is relevant, and you seem to have different methods that you bring interesting findings. You're not afraid of contradicting yourself in a chapter, I think the last chapter in chapter 2. So it looks like a very, very good work. So first, congratulations for that.
Thank you.
For being able to present it in a very simple and clear way. So congrats for that. I don't have a precise question, but I think, yeah, of course, the topic of the crisis or alleged crisis or supposed crisis of representative democracy is something that we are all very interested in, and I think we all, at a point, work on the topic. So you started saying that representative democracy is in crisis, but then when you look at the numbers, it seems like actually it's maybe the one size fits all model, because at the end it's kind of supported by your data. Like most citizens say, okay, well, it's still a valid model, but at the same time we have all these symptoms that are telling us there's a problem, or there are so many different problems. So lack of trust, dissatisfaction, lower turnout. So I think there are so many different explanation of why people get angry about democracy or about the system, and I think it makes it so complex to bring solutions as well. Because, and I think something that I like also with the chapter on local, like the local cities, that you try to go on the ground and look at practices, and I think the way citizens practice democracy or their everyday life with democracy, that's what matters, because that's what makes them maybe so disappointed by politicians they voted for, or very dissatisfied with the policies that are implemented, or very angry because there are corrupt politicians. And I think the challenge is it's so easy to lose trust of people. It's so easy to get people angry, but then it's so much more complicated to get trust back and to get satisfaction back and to make people agree again with the way the system works. And people can be angry for so many things, like inefficiency of the system, and at another point, like too efficient system because the policies pass so fast that they don't have the time to protest against the policy. So I mean, it's so complex and so interesting to have you also working on that. There is something that I miss sometimes in this literature on the alternative model of democracy is the party politics, because parties, and I work on parties, so you know it's my favorite topic ever. Representative democracy, but maybe less in some countries, maybe more in some countries. Political parties are organizations that actually kind of organize representative democracy. They're like some, you know, organizations that are between citizens and politicians. And I missed a bit of where are the parties in there. And they're at the same time very important to make the system function, to aggregate preferences, but they are also the least trusted institutions or organization. So I was wondering, in some of your chapters, you take into account also these parties, and also in the solutions. So you cited electoral reforms, but a lot of reforms are occurring within political parties, and parties themselves try, well, not always in the good way, to reconnect with people, because I think that is one of the causes of crisis as well. Is like parties have lost their capacity to make people's voice heard. And as a party scholar, I think that if we had political parties that were more connected to people, and elected politicians who had, because some politicians, they really want to get to people, but people hate them, so they're not welcome. They don't have the time to, like, you know, go on the ground and meet people. So I think in the solutions, there are solutions that could relate to the capacity of individual politicians and parties to kind of go back to their function of being like linkage organization. So maybe in the next presentation, in the solution, you can say, yeah, maybe we can look at this aspect. Or like legal aspect as well, like punishing corrupt politicians, make sure that those who fail, those who profit from the system are actually punished, and communicate to citizens about that, like the system does not accept that we have these corrupt politicians. So there might be other solutions that would connect to the symptoms. So I stopped there. But congratulations. So no specific question. I think it's a fantastic way to open the seminar series. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. I do think it's an interesting one. I don't know if I have anything interesting to say about it, but with regards to parties, it's of course, true that they are in this position where they can drive innovation as well. You can have a new party that says, look, we're going to do things entirely differently. We're going to, for example, adopt the system of direct democracy in some way by really gouging citizens' views on, let's say, a whole list of topics, which in some ways is known, of course, but if parties could say, parties are the ones, I think, if we want to see change, who should say, look, there are other ways to do things, and here are the benefits, and I think we can try them. I don't think the change indeed is going to come from citizens. It's going to come from a group of people who drive it. So, and those are the parties. And I agree with you on that. So, yeah.
Any other questions?
According to your experience and the data you've been serving, what would bring an elected person to accept to give more power to the people through deliberative or direct democracy? You know? Or do they stick more to their position and this kind of result that you show give them a good info for them to say, well, you see, we're still the best way to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm. No, I understand. I think it's difficult because, and maybe that's me just being a little bit too cynical, but also a lot of politicians obviously are in politics because they are convinced that there is a hierarchy and that there are certain ways of doing things that are better than others, and they are going to be somewhat maybe less flexible than citizens can be, exactly because they are in this party system and they have an ideology and they have ideas that they want to see implemented. So I think there's a danger there even, and we also see it in the literature that also with politicians and with people in general, they are more supportive of those alternatives that of which they are convinced that they will lead to the outcome. And also, there's also a whole literature on winners versus losers. So those who are typically on the sidelines don't really get there. You could say the more extreme parties, for example, you could say in a way maybe they are more supportive of organizing referendums, for example, because they know that there is they might pull out a majority opinion there that favors their interests. So that is something to take into account, I think, also when looking at parties and what they when they say they are in favor of referendums, for example.
Any other questions? No. And I think we can conclude. I want to thank Ruben very much for this very, very interesting first talk. I think the audience said it already. This was a first fantastic introduction to the Thursday seminar. So thank you. Thanks also to the audience for being here, for these very interesting questions. And see you next week.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you. Okay. I'm happy. It was a nice discussion. Yeah.